Hi there. So I'm going to answer questions number 2 and number 3 for chapter 7, starting with question number 2, which is about the intersectionality of race and gender and basically income, right? So on page 169, there was this graph that clearly show that disparity between men and women, right? And just know that, or notice actually, that across all those races there, women earn less than men. So not only do other races earn less than white people, except for Asians. I was surprised to learn that Asians make more than white people. So except for that group, the gap gets bigger when we consider gender as well. So, and on that graph, the biggest difference was found between Asian men and Hispanic women. So Asian men earn like twice as much as Hispanic women, which is just outrageous. And considering like, even if they were doing different jobs, I mean, that tells a lot about how the labor market is distributed by races. So on the next page, we also learn that white women are more likely to get highly paid positions as opposed to black women. So these are just two examples of how gender and race intersect in the labor market. So if you're a woman, you're at a disadvantage. If you're a person of color, you are at a disadvantage. And these two combined are going to be most likely a greater disadvantage for you. So for number 3, it asked the question about incarceration and why we have to take that into consideration when trying to understand the labor market inequality. So one of the ways that we also see inequality is in the unemployment rates, right? People of color are more likely to be unemployed than white people. So when the government comes up with this data about unemployment rate, we don't get to see the whole picture because they're not taking into account people who are in prison, right? Because people in prison don't have an income, although they kind of do. They get paid like cents, a certain amount of cents per day or something like that, which is basically like slave labor. But that's another issue. So since they don't have an income, really they're not even considered for this unemployment rate. But guess what? Black people are by far overrepresented in prisons. So when you consider the unemployment rate for the Black community, and then you add the number of unemployed people because of incarceration, that rate goes up big time. So on page 177, the author claims something that for me was just heartbreaking and very scary. The author claimed that 1 in 3 Black males born in the 21st century, aka our century, will be incarcerated. I had heard that it was 1 out of 4. Now it seems that number just got worse to basically 1 out of 3. So not only are these people in prison not being employed, they don't have an income, but even after they get out of prison, they have to face the consequences of basically not being able to find a job because they have a record. And for those that are lucky enough to find a job, their incomes probably suck. They don't get good wages. So, and then even then, when we consider white people who have been to jail with Black people who have been to jail, like white people still make more than Black people. So I found on page 179 that Black men's wages grow at a 20% rate slower than white people's wages after they've been to prison and they've been released. So that was very interesting. So for chapter 8, I didn't put the number of the questions here, but identify and describe 3 specific ways in which slavery shaped wealth inequality between Blacks and whites. So one of the reasons for this huge disparity of wealth that we see today in the U.S. has to do with the dark history of slavery, as we already learned that from this chapter. So it goes without saying that slaves could not own any property. I mean, they couldn't even own themselves, right? Let alone a piece of land. So that was that's one factor. The second basically is that even after they were emancipated, at first they couldn't own land. But then, okay, they kind of did, they realized, okay, we got to give them a chance. But even then, I was reading that, for example, in 1866, the slaves were given a chance to own some land, right, through the Southern Homestead Act, which allocated 46 million acres of public lands for homesteading in 5 southern states, right? And that was on page 198. Now, blacks and whites were allowed to apply for this, but somehow by the early 1900s, only a quarter of black farmers owned their own land. So you can, I guess, and any, this section of the chapter is not extensive, but you can imagine that black people who try to own their lands, they were basically persecuted. White people would come and take their lands and just do violent acts against them, and just so many things. So for this reason, many black people moved to northern cities looking for better opportunities, only to find themselves segregated into these poor neighborhoods, which again just prevented them from building wealth over time. So those are your 3 specific ways there. So for the next question for chapter A, according to the text, is it correct to state that residential segregation is due to people of color's choices? Why or why not? So it's not correct, okay? People don't, well, generally speaking, I will say, people don't want to be segregated. On page 208, we learned that segregation is a result of racism, right? And also in formal and informal practices that keep people divided. I mean, throughout this chapter, we read about how, what was redlining and steering, and the predatory lenders, and how these people just targeted black people and just pushed them and cornered them into these poor neighborhoods. So on that page, on page 2, we read about a study, right, where researchers conducted interviews to 2,000 black families. And they asked them, basically, they showed them different fictitious neighborhoods, right, where the racial ratio was different for each one of them. And most of them wanted to live in neighborhoods where it was basically even out between blacks and whites, right? Only like 20% wanted to live in mostly black neighborhoods. So it's not really a matter of like a personal choice, and I think it's just an excuse that a lot of people use to not face the fact that, hey, we have systemic racism and hence systemic segregation, even though they're not specific laws, blatant laws that are like, that segregate people. We still have the remnant of, or the residue of those laws back in earlier in the 1900s and throughout basically the whole century. So, and another way to picture this is that, for example, if you're a person of color and you're poor and you live in a poor neighborhood, I mean, wouldn't you want to move to a better neighborhood? I guess so. I guess that any person would say, yeah, well, I want to move to a better neighborhood with better job opportunities, better schooling. But guess what? If you're poor, your resources for being able to move are very limited. Like if you're struggling to pay bills because your job doesn't pay you well because you're black, I mean, chances are, how on earth are you going to be able to move, and just move your whole family to a better neighborhood, and let alone afford that new place. So anyway, I thought these were very interesting questions.